India, the world's largest democracy and home to over 1 billion people. A land of diverse cultures, religions, and traditions, India has a rich history that stretches back over 5,000 years. From the ancient Indus Valley civilization to the modern-day metropolises of Mumbai and New Delhi, India has undergone significant changes throughout its history. But one period in India's recent history had a profound impact on its development and place in the world. The Cold War, a geopolitical struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union, had far-reaching consequences for many nations, including India. As a country situated between these two superpowers, India found itself in a unique position. India gained independence from British colonial rule in 1947 and established a democratic government with Jawaharlal Nehru as its first prime minister. Nehru envisioned India as a non-aligned nation, committed to peaceful coexistence and non-interference in the affairs of other countries. However, the Cold War era brought a new set of challenges for India. As the United States and the Soviet Union engaged in proxy wars around the world, India became a crucial theater in the global struggle for power.
India's position as a neutral nation during the Cold War was a unique one, and it often found itself caught in the middle of the proxy battles fought between the United States and the Soviet Union. As a result, India's foreign policy during the Cold War was heavily influenced by these events. The Korean War and the Vietnam War were two of the most significant proxy wars fought during the Cold War. India remained neutral in both conflicts, but was heavily involved in the negotiations for the armistice that ended the Korean War. India's role in the Korean War negotiations was significant, as it provided a neutral platform for discussions between the United States, North Korea, and China. India's involvement in the Vietnam War was limited to sending peacekeeping forces after the conflict ended, but the country's non-aligned stance during the war allowed it to maintain its strategic interests elsewhere. India's foreign policy during the Cold War was heavily influenced by the country's desire to remain neutral and not become aligned with either the United States or the Soviet Union. India maintained diplomatic relations with both superpowers and used its non-aligned stance to advocate for peace and disarmament. Indian leaders such as Jawaharlal Nehru and Indira Gandhi played significant roles in promoting peace and disarmament during the Cold War, making India an influential voice in international affairs.
India supported the North Korean regime during the Korean War and played a significant role in the Vietnam War, providing aid and support to the North Vietnamese. The Cold War era also saw India undergoing significant economic changes, with the adoption of socialist policies and the focus on import substitution. Despite facing numerous challenges, India's economy witnessed a steady growth rate, with the GDP reaching $200 billion by the end of the Cold War era. India's rich cultural heritage also underwent significant changes during the Cold War era, with influences from both the Soviet Union and the United States. The period also witnessed a rise in religious fundamentalism and communal tensions, leading to several instances of violence and upheaval. Today, India's foreign policy is guided by the principles of non-alignment and strategic autonomy, shaped by the country's experiences during the Cold War era. India maintains diplomatic relations with both the United States and the Russian Federation, while also strengthening ties with other nations. Political and economic state. During the Cold War, India was a newly independent country, having gained independence from British colonial rule in 1947. India adopted a democratic political system, with elections held regularly and a parliamentary form of government. India also adopted a mixed economy model, with both state-owned enterprises and private businesses coexisting. India remained a democracy throughout the Cold War period, and there were no major changes to its political system. However, there were some peaceful disruptions, such as the rise of regional parties in some states and the introduction of coalition governments. However, India's economy struggled during this period, with low levels of industrialization and infrastructure development. The country also faced significant challenges in terms of poverty and inequality, which the government attempted to address through various social welfare programs. During this era, India's economy was largely based on agriculture and traditional industries. The government followed a mixed economy model, with both public and private sectors playing a role in the economy. India's GDP grew at an average rate of 3.5% per year during the Cold War period. In the 1990s, India began to open up its economy to foreign investment and liberalize its trade policies, leading to an increase in economic growth. The focus of the Indian economy during the Cold War period was on achieving self-sufficiency through import substitution. This involved encouraging the development of domestic industries to replace imports. India had economic relations with both the Soviet Union and the United States, but it maintained a policy of non-alignment. India had limited access to modern technology during the Cold War period due to its economic policies and lack of investment in research and development. In terms of foreign policy, India maintained a policy of non-alignment, which meant that it did not align itself with either of the two major powers during the Cold War. This policy was intended to maintain India's independence and sovereignty while promoting peace and cooperation with all nations. Impact of proxy wars. India's position as a non-aligned nation did not prevent it from being involved in the proxy wars of the Cold War. For example, India supported the communist government in Afghanistan during the Soviet invasion in the 1980s. This support strained India's relations with the U.S., which was supporting the Afghan Mujahideen. India also supported the communist government in Vietnam during the Vietnam War, while the U.S. supported the South Vietnamese government. India also supported other national liberation movements in Africa and Latin America. However, India's involvement in these proxy wars also had consequences for its relationship with the U.S. and other Western powers, as they saw India as supporting their enemies. This led to strained relations with these countries and a shift towards closer ties with the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union saw India as a key player in the non-aligned movement, which advocated for the independence and sovereignty of nations not aligned with either the United States or the Soviet Union. India's relationship with the Soviet Union was particularly strong during the 1960s and 1970s, when India's Prime Minister Indira Gandhi sought to modernize the country's economy and military with Soviet assistance. India purchased significant amounts of military equipment from the Soviet Union, including tanks, fighter jets, and submarines. The economic ties between India and the Soviet Union were also significant, with the Soviet Union providing aid, loans, and technical expertise to help India develop industries such as steel, power, and heavy machinery. India also imported crude oil from the Soviet Union. India's ties with the Soviet Union began to decline in the 1980s as India pursued economic liberalization and began to engage more with the West. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 further weakened the relationship, although India has maintained some ties with Russia in the post-Cold War era. Military relationships and strategic interests. India's military relationships with the two superpowers did impact its strategic interests elsewhere. India received military aid from both the US and the Soviet Union at different points during the Cold War. This aid allowed India to build up its military capabilities and defend itself against external threats. However, this aid also came with strings attached, and India had to balance its strategic interests with the interests of its allies. Cultural impact. India's culture underwent some changes during the Cold War period due to Western influence and modernization. For example, the rise of Bollywood films and Western-style clothing were signs of cultural change. However, traditional Indian culture and religion remained strong and continued to influence daily life. In spite of that, there were also attempts by the US and other Western powers to influence Indian culture through various means, including media and education. Despite these attempts, Indian culture remained resilient and continued to thrive. However, many Indians attempted to emigrate to other countries for better opportunities. India's culture did change somewhat due to outside influences. For example, the introduction of satellite television and globalization brought Western cultural influences to India. Religion and religious practices remained largely unchanged, with Hinduism being the dominant religion. Social structures and the rights of different groups did change, however. India's constitution guaranteed equal rights for all citizens, regardless of religion or caste, but discrimination and inequality continued to exist. Religious practices in India did not change significantly during the Cold War period. However, there were some political tensions between different religious groups, particularly between Hindus and Muslims. These tensions occasionally led to violence, such as the communal riots that occurred in the aftermath of the partition of India and Pakistan in 1947. Social structures in India also remained largely unchanged during the Cold War period. India has a complex social structure based on caste, which remains a significant factor in Indian society. However, there were some efforts to address social inequalities through affirmative action policies and other initiatives. The Cold War had a significant impact on India in various aspects. India's non-alignment stance allowed it to maintain independence and distance from both the US-led Western Bloc and the USSR-led Eastern Bloc. India also saw itself become entangled in regional proxy wars and experienced an arms race with its neighbors. The country's economy struggled to modernize, and poverty remained a significant issue. The political climate of India underwent changes, with a shift from Congress dominance to the rise of regional parties. The Cold War also brought cultural changes to India, such as an increase in Western influences and the spread of consumerism. Overall, the Cold War had far-reaching effects on India, shaping its foreign policy, economy, politics, and culture for decades to come.